Hi, and welcome to the RubySorce podcast. Today, joining me is Pablo Fernandez. Pablo, thanks for joining me today. How's everything?
Everything is very well. Thank you for having me, Sawan.
Of course. Pablo, let's go straight into your experience with Ruby. So tell me a bit more about when you started working with it and that sort of thing.
Oh, I've been doing it for like 15 years now. I remember touching the first version of Rails before 1.0, and I think the first time I built like a proper application was Rails 2.0. And at that point, it was mostly like spare time, fun projects, and yeah, I immediately fell in love with the productivity of using Rails compared to everything else. I think it was back in the days when there was this video in the Rails website showing how to build a blog in 15 minutes, and we were all blown away by it. I was one of those blown away by it, yeah. And I've been using it since then, on and off. Sometimes for business, sometimes for my own companies.
A pleasure. Yeah, nice. And how are you using it these days?
So these days, I'm the CTO at Koinly. Koinly uses Ruby and Rails, and it became very common these days where Rails became an API. So it's a backend that has an API, and I think a lot of companies are doing that these days where they're not providing. They have a separate front end that is normally JavaScript using React or Angular or Vue or one of those, and that's how we use it at work. We also have some microservices that are Ruby services, not full on Rails applications. Personally, what I discovered that made me sort of fall in love with Rails all over again is Hotwire, which was released like a couple of years ago, and it's now part of Rails 7, and it allows you to build what behaves like a single page application with all of like that dynamic changes, but all of that happens from a Rails application without having a separate front end. And once again, I find that Rails it's bringing a massive productivity boost. And throughout the last 15 years, every now and then I compare Rails to other things. And what I do is I build the same application using many different technologies. And Rails is always so much faster to like having the thing in production, right? And I've been wondering a lot about where this is going, because I understand the need for a separate front end, but also for a company that's just starting, that has two developers, using something like Hotwire, like they gain so much because then they have two backend developers instead of it gives you a granularity of how you manage that team that you don't have if you have one backend developer and one front end developer that you need to synchronize.
And tell me a bit more about the business that you first started in 2010, which you used Ruby with, right?
Yeah. So I had 3 startups in my life that were like, I would say, proper startups. The first one did not use Ruby. It was Here blog. It lasted 9 months. It was amazing, but it was not working. The second one, it did use, there I used Ruby and I used Rails. I co-founded with a guy called Julian Johnson, who was an amazing natural salesperson, and I loved working with him. Those first 2 years were some of my favorites in my career. And yeah, it was using Ruby and Rails. And the productivity that we had was amazing. Like we were producing things so quickly. And the application ran for 8 years until we sold the startup. And it never had a major incident. Even like in year 5 or so, we put it in maintenance mode. We stopped developing. I was not actively contributing to it. Nobody was. And still the application kept on going, like churning along. Customers using it, very happy. And I think that in part, it comes from what Ruby and Rails allows us to do there. One interesting bit was that it was really hard to hire Ruby and Rails developers. This is 2011. Like this is when 2011, 2012.
Yeah.
And like I completely ignored it. Like I did not even try to hire Ruby developers because they were so sought after, and I went straight for who can learn Ruby, and I identify people that do you have the skills to learn Ruby, and come and learn Ruby in the job, and I would coach them and so on, and generally it would take like between 2 weeks to a month for them to be up to speed and working. Yeah. That was my secret weapon.
That's interesting though. So what did you what languages were you looking for like these developers to have experience with if they didn't have Ruby experience? Was there any particular area that you thought, you know, like this would make a good Ruby developer, like this person would make a good Ruby developer?
Well, you can go for like languages that are similar, like Python or Perl. Like we were still using Perl a little bit, like are dynamic, that are interpreted. But that's not exactly what I was searching for. What I was searching for was, and I still do this every time that I hire an engineer, I'm searching for the ability to learn. The way that I do it is twofold. I search for which things they have learned in the past. So, for example, if somebody only knows one programming language, that's a bad signal. I'm searching for people that know 3 programming languages at least, because that shows somebody that when you learn a programming language, you learn to code. When you learn the second one, and this happens with natural languages as well, when you learn the second one, you learn what concepts are part of the programming languages and what concepts are the abstract ones that are just programming. And when you learn the third one, that's when you come and say like, oh, I already know these things. And I just applied, and I'm just learning a new syntax. And somebody that went through that process, learning the fourth, they're going to be very quickly. And that's what I search for. And I search for how do you learn? How do you learn on your own? Do you use books? Do you use courses? And that's part of my interview process. Like at the very beginning, those are the questions that I ask.
Right. Okay. It makes sense. But obviously now there's tons of Ruby developers out there, so you don't really need to look into that sort of thing, do you think? Or do you still use that approach?
I still use that approach because technology changes all the time. Like next year, maybe it won't be Ruby. And next year, maybe we'll have to learn something else, something new. We're going to be doing AI. We're going to be doing like crypto, like something different. And I don't want to reach a point where, oh, we cannot do this new thing because nobody in the team knows it.
Yeah.
What I always want to do is to just say, okay, give us 2 weeks and we'll have half the team knowing it. That's why I need that constant learning inside the team. And I do it as well. Like right now, I'm learning Rust and Go, right? They are like they are the new hotness that everybody's talking about. And even though I'm not coding on the day-to-day at work, I'm still coding for fun on the weekends, and I'm still making decisions of, are we going to use Rust or Go? I need to understand them, right? So I'm still learning, and I'm still a beginner on many things. And going back to that, which sometimes hurts.
What did so this business that you were talking about with Julian Johnson? I think you and I have spoken about Julian Johnson before, but yeah, what did that business do?
So Watu was an application for temporary staffing agencies. I can give you an example that is very clear, which is a real example. When this was during the Olympics, Samsung came. They had a new phone. This was when smartphones were exploding, right? It was a few years after iPhone. Android was like growing in popularity, and Samsung wanted to have booths all over London showing the new Samsung phones. And they went to an agency and they said, okay, we're going to have 20 booths all over London. Each of those need to have 3 people in them at all times that know how to use a phone and know how to show a phone. And one of those 3 needs to be the manager that sort of manages the work of the other 2, but also does the work. And our customers would be the company that would arrange those 20 teams on shifts, like 7 days a week, several shifts per day. That is like, I don't know, 200, 300 people that got rotated through all of that. What was the application that this agency would use to put together those teams, assign the shift, run payroll, have people apply to to those shifts sometimes, have people exchange like when they were working, because sometimes one person was busy, do the assessment of whether the work was good and choose who to continue working with and so on. So it did all of that. It was, for the temporary staffing agencies, it became everything. They lived inside Watu. For me, one of my highlights of my careers is when I saw somebody's curriculum, like somebody's CV that said Watu as one of their skills. That was like, I made it.
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, and so what are you co-founder / CTO, right? Like technical.
Yes.
Co-founder.
Yeah.
And how many people did you end up hiring? Like, did you end up with scaling throughout the business?
We didn't scale massively. I hired 5 engineers there. And at some point, my CEO had some personal things to take care of, and he had to take a step back from the company. So I also ended up being the CEO of the company, which was an amazing lesson, because I ended up managing salespeople and marketing people and dealing with finances and taxes and legal and all of these things. Like, it was a crash course. I don't know what a salesperson does. So I learned a lot, which these days helps me a lot when I'm the CTO of the company, in how I cooperate with the other heads of departments, with the CFO, with the heads of sales, with the heads of marketing and so on, because I have that understanding of when I had to manage one of them, of the problems that they came to me, like I can be proactive and go to them. But yes, I hired 5 engineers, all of them new to Ruby. Well, all of them were new to Ruby. And that was when I started managing. And I used to be the typical engineer that saw management as this like evil thing that I don't know why it exists, why it's there. And then we hired a couple of people. It's like, oh, dang it, I'm a manager now. Oh, now I understand. And to be honest, I did really badly, because I didn't know what I was doing. It was my first time. I made so many mistakes. I love talking to first-time CTOs about these things, because I think I can help them not make the same mistakes that I made back then. But I learned a lot, and I am actually super privileged in that I got to a point where when I'm coding, I feel like, oh, this is my calling. This is what I really like, writing code. And when I'm managing, I feel, oh, this is my calling. This is what I really like. So I love it no matter what I'm doing. Yeah.
So you've touched on something that I wanted to talk to you about, actually, about how you sort of managed or dealt with conflict in the team that you that you managed.
Yeah. So conflict. I would say that at the very beginning, badly, because I didn't know what I was doing. Over time, I learned a lot. And there's one book for anybody that wants to work on conflict resolution. The book is called Nonviolent Communication. And it deals essentially how to communicate to resolve conflicts. And the book, I would recommend anybody to try to stick with the book, even though when you start reading, it might not feel relevant, because the book covers cases of couples and their conflicts, like marital conflicts, all the way up to diplomatic conflicts between tribes that are at war with each other in Africa. Right.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
But when you start reading the book, if the first examples are not what you are facing on the day-to-day, it can be hard to identify with what's going on. So I recommend anybody that starts reading it to stick with the book and try to get the lesson from it. And the main lessons is, when there's a conflict, try to empathize with the needs of each person behind the conflict. Try to ignore how they are behaving to get to those needs. When somebody is being rude, maybe they don't know they're being rude, or maybe they're being rude because they have a need that they haven't met. And getting to that need, like, you cannot just address the rudeness. You get to get past that and get to the need. And that is a thing that nonviolent communication teaches you how to do for yourself, like when you have a need, how you express it without being rude, but also how to help somebody else express that need without that rudeness. It is much harder to do it, I think, when you're trying to work with somebody else. Ideally, if everybody reads the book, we can all develop that skill of communication, which prevents a lot of conflict. One thing that I do is in my teams, I do very frequent one-on-ones in which I build rapport with the engineers.
Yeah.
So that they bring me their conflicts as early as possible, because pretty much all of the conflicts are a tiny escalation on a tiny escalation on a tiny escalation that accumulated over time. So if you try to unravel these pile up of tiny escalations 3 months later, it might actually be impossible. But if you get it at the very, very early on, it's like, oh, this person said this, which is rude, like it hurt me. At that point, like at the first insult, you can go and like work out what happened. It's like, oh, that person didn't mean it because we're an international team and we all use different words and we're coming with different natural words, and they mean different things and they have a different connotation, and that word is normal on that country. And then I go to one and it's like, please don't take offense in that person using that word, and I go to the other one and it's like, please don't use that word, because for other people it can be hurtful, right?
Yeah, nice. This is something that I've talked about with people before, because when they're working for companies where, you know, people are working remotely in different countries and stuff, this type of thing comes up quite often because of the way that in like languages, or even if English is a second language for somebody, you know, things are misconstrued and miscommunicated, or somebody might, like you said, might take offense at something that somebody else has said. So yeah, that's I get where you're coming from. What about challenges that you had to overcome, like not to do with the team or with any, you know, with that specific company, but just in your career? Like how have you overcome challenges that you faced?
Oh, that's an interesting question.
Or even to better that question, how about what were the biggest challenges that you had to overcome?
Yeah, some of the biggest challenges are that I don't have any formal background. I am self-taught.
Sure.
And there's a lot of prejudice against people that are being self-taught in certain circles, and proving that you can do the work when you don't have the credentials, that is challenging, and that requires this. I'm not sure if this is the right word, but it requires being somewhat aggressive in like setting the goals and targets and so on, so that the outcomes will be, so that you will be allowed the opportunity to get there. And I have found, because I'm very aggressive and I'm very ambitious with my career,
sure,
I am always like aiming for like the next very hard step, whatever it is, and often you depend on other people giving you that opportunity. It just doesn't fall on your lap when you don't have that track record. And over time that changes a little bit. But I think that's one of the of the hardest challenges.
But Pablo, would you say that that's still the case nowadays, though, considering you've got, you know, such a long career, you know, you've been CTO, you've been in senior positions. Would you say that people would still look back on your early days and see like there's no computer science degree, or, you know?
So as I was saying, I was asking myself that same question. It's like, oh, this surely is not true now, but I am still I still want harder challenges. So yes, like the level at which I got with my career up to now, it has unlocked a certain amount of opportunities, but it hasn't unlocked all of the opportunities. And I'm still interested. Like I'm always looking at like the next challenge. Like how do I grow and pushing myself? And I think this has something to do with there's some research on this which shows that you progress faster if you're always at the edge of your skills, and that's something that I'm interested. And if I remember correctly, DHH did that with his car racing, where normally like there's a convention that you don't advance in category until you're a champion of one category. Okay. But you can submit for any of the categories. So I hope I'm not getting this wrong. So he would advance the category as soon as he got third place, and people were like, "No, you're doing it wrong." But what he was doing is like he was constantly increasing the challenge, and he was progressing faster on average than somebody that waited until they were champion of one category and went to the next one.
Yeah.
So the challenging thing is that I like to challenge myself, and it's completely self-inflicted.
But yeah, fair enough. But so okay, so you've worked for Google. Yes. Now I would think, or most people would think, that Google would hire people that have been to university, have degrees from good unis, good colleges, etc. So how has somebody that's a self-taught programmer wangled his way into working for Google?
That's a good question. I don't know what happened there. I think okay, so I think this is what happens, and I don't think I have ever publicly said this. I don't know what the policy is right now. The policy back then was that Google would not hire anybody without a university degree. And my secondary, so I am from Argentina, and there we have technical secondary schools, and my secondary degree, like my secondary school degree, is electronics and mechatronics technician or something like that. And
okay.
And I just put it in my CV at that point because I think it's still there, but it's not that relevant these days. And I think somebody made a mistake. I think somebody read that and they thought this is a college degree.
This is a degree.
And they just let me through. And so I was not trying to misrepresent myself. I was not aware of the policy. I was not trying to lie or anything. So at no point it came up. Like years later, I heard about this policy and I was like, what?
Yeah.
What happened here? And this is entirely my hypothesis. I don't know what happened here. I am glad that I didn't know, because I think I would have felt I wouldn't have, like, if I landed the interview and the false pretenses, I would have felt so uncomfortable that my self-confidence would have been very low and my performance would have been horrible.
Yeah.
So it was an accident.
Anyway, it's done now. Fine.
Yes.
You're so on Google, actually, we've spoken about this before. You wrote some Ruby code, didn't you, whilst you were at Google, and had a bit of a bit of a telling off.
Yes, I wrote Ruby code at Google, and I was told off. And what happened was that I was writing a tiny script. It was 10 lines of code for driving a dashboard screen at the office, which was one of my responsibilities. At Google, I was all of the dashboards showing like the continuous integration and state of things at my office, that we had like massive projectors. It was amazing. And then later on, I did a startup around it called Dashman with some ideas that I had around those problems.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote that first 10 lines of Python code, and there was one library that had a bug.
Ruby code, Python code.
The Python code. So I wrote it in Python, but there was one library that I needed to make the thing work that had a bug, and it was not working, and I could not find a workaround for that bug. And I essentially renamed that file to .rb and changed like a couple of characters here and there, because Python and Ruby, like if you're just like if you have like a very tiny script, they're so close to each other. And yeah, I made a few changes and I made it work. And it just happened that the same library from Ruby didn't have the bug, so it just worked. And yeah, I got told off because it was a non-sanctioned language, and I was told like who's going to maintain it. And it was just a 10-line script.
Fair enough. Cool. And so I think let's move on to our last sort of topic that we were talking about. Your book. What is it
yes.
about, actually? What's it about?
So my book, yes, I have some copies here.
Yeah, go on. Let's have a little plug of this.
Thank you.
How to hire and manage remote teams.
Yes. So I had my first remote job in something like 2004. I was in Argentina. The internet connection was so slow that we definitely could not have a video conference. And I'm not sure if we could even have a voice call. We never talked to each other. We just used IRC. And what happened is that this job came out of being an open source contributor. I was an open source contributor to a desktop system called KDE in the Linux world. Mm-hmm. And a company that was around that hired me to work on some things. And it was completely distributed and completely asynchronous. And that's how I started. And over the years, on and off, I worked remotely. First, until Watu, I was an individual contributor working remotely. The first startup, the one that I mentioned, that lasted only 9 months. My business partner was 15,000 kilometers away. We knew each other. We went to school together, but we were living in different continents. Then Watu, we didn't have money for an office. So we had an office that another company was lending to us until they said, like, you need to get out. Yeah. And we still didn't have money for an office, so we went distributed. And that's the first time that I started managing a team that was fully distributed. And for Watu, that was really good because I started hiring people from all over the place, and that was amazing. Mm-hmm. And that's sort of when I fell in love with the fully distributed remote way of working. Fast forward to 2020, and COVID happens, right? And my team, so I was working at a company that was not fully remote, but my department was. Okay. And when I noticed, I calculated that COVID was going to be a disaster, like in early January. When I saw the first time I saw the R0 number, I did a back of the envelope calculation and went like, oh man, we're in trouble. This is going to be a problem. And I was like going to the companies like, we need to get ready and run simulations of remote work before we actually have to do it, because we're going to find issues, but this is coming. And indeed it came, and the company had to go fully remote. And the reality is that because my department was fully remote, my department barely noticed anything happen. Most of my team was living in very remote areas, so they were not even massively affected by lockdowns. And we kept on being productive. We kept on having the morale high. We did very well, and that meant that the other departments at the company ended up having conversations with the other managers about this, because they were asking, okay, now everybody needs to do what Pablo has been doing for a while. How do you do it? And I started talking about it. And that's sort of when I realized that I had a lot of habits that were not completely obvious that I gained over the years of doing it, that I could share with the world. And I started writing some blog pieces, and then I went to communities. And I remember 2020 as a time where the world was hurting. My partner, she is an emergency doctor. Life was incredibly difficult for her. It affected both of us, like the decontamination whenever she came home, the scares of COVID, like it was hard. And I could also see like a lot of other companies that were hurting. And I sort of made myself available to anybody that wanted to have a conversation about any issues with remote work, to try to troubleshoot and help them solve those problems. I just wanted to sort of help a world that was hurting in the only way that I could think of. Yeah. And it ended up being that they wrote my table of contents because they were coming with questions like, oh, yes, this is what I have to say about that. Oh, yes, this is what I have to say about that. And it started with the blog post and eventually turned into a book. And when I say it eventually turned into a book, I mean like 1,000 hours of extra work after I finished writing the last period of content, it turned into a book, because putting together a book is a ridiculous amount of work. I did not expect that.
Yeah, I can imagine. Okay, perfect. Pablo, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a pleasure to talk with you.
It was a pleasure here as well. Thank you very much, Sawan.